It is great to be with you. We have been able to be here so often over the last 9 years that it almost doesn't seem like visiting anymore. It's always great to see all of you. We got to enjoy your vacation Bible school not long ago, and you have a gospel meeting coming up that we're looking forward to, and we look forward to every opportunity to be with you. You have been a great encouragement to me, personally, to my family. Anytime we get to come and be with you, you're always so gracious and so sweet and supportive, and we thank you for that. As Chad mentioned, tonight we'll be studying from 2 Kings 5. If you turn your Bibles there, we are looking at a particular question that comes in the middle of this situation. And anybody who's been a Bible student for very long has done much study in the Old Testament. This account really catches your attention because it's dealing with some certain characters. And as we look at the characters of this account, we're going to see some very big differences, some notable differences between them. And I want us to picture this tonight and understand that a whole lot of what this account has to deal with, as I'm looking at it, has to do with perspective. Remember that Naaman, as it tells us in verse 1, is a captain of the host of the king of Syria. He is a prominent figure, a powerful man. It says he's honorable, he is highly honored because through the Lord's working, he had worked and helped to deliver Syria. And we know about Syria and Assyria and the conflicts that were going on between them. More than likely at this time in history, we know that one of the kings that would have fit right about this time would have been Ben-Hadad. Although it doesn't tell us a name in the text of either one of the kings. We also know that during Elisha's work as a prophet for Israel, that the Israelite king that was dealt with most of that time was Jehoram. So we could be looking at Ben-Hadad and Jehoram in Syria and Israel, but it doesn't tell us their names, and what we need to see from that is it's not important what their names are. Their stance in history is not what's being viewed here. But we are seeing the prominent figure of this text, or the prominent figures of this text, being Naaman, the captain of the host, and being Elisha, the man of God. But we're going to note several characters as we come through this study together tonight because they jump out at us. And I say that this is a study of perspective, and we know what perspective is. If you're looking at art and someone is a very skilled artist, they can draw something or paint something that looks like it has more than one dimension to it. If you walk right up to it, you see that it's a canvas or a piece of paper or a chalkboard or whatever they're drawing on or painting on. It's one dimension. But if they're skilled at what they're doing, they can put perspective to the artwork and make it look like it has depth, make it look like it's 2 or even 3-dimensional. When we see something like that, it draws our attention to what it means to see a perspective. Another way that perspective jumps out at us is in the way we see things every day. If an automobile accident happens out here on the street, and there are people at several different vantage points who see the accident, when they start giving their eyewitness report to the officer, we all realize that they're not going to say the exact same things. And we know why. The reason why they're not saying the exact same things is a matter of perspective. If they're all being honest and all telling exactly what they saw, they would see some different things based on their perspective, their vantage point. So as we look at this text tonight, we're going to keep that word in mind, the word perspective, and we're going to look at this together. Let's read the text together, starting in verse 1. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, and 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, Now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. And it came to pass, when the king of Israel had read the letter, that he rent his clothes, and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. And it was so, when Elisha the man of God had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him now come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. But Naaman was wroth, and went away and said, Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand, and call on the name of the Lord his God, and strike his hand over the place, and recover the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spake unto him and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he saith to thee, Wash and be clean? Then went he down and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. As we read this account, again, there are numerous characters, but what I want us to focus on, and who I want us to focus on first, is the number of things we find in this that have to deal with something that is, or someone that is splendid. Someone that is of great power, of great influence, of great wealth, or otherwise very notable. Naaman is the first character that we see who we would describe as being splendid in everything about him except for the last detail. It says in verse 1, he is the captain of the host. Do you know who else in the Old Testament is described in this way? But instead of captain, the word Lord is put there. The Lord of hosts. Someone who is the captain, the leader, the authority over the hosts of heaven, over all of the hosts of the earth. Now, of course, Naaman is not put in this realm, but the descriptive phrase here is very similar. It's limiting because he is the captain of the host of the king of Syria, not of all of the armies of the world, of this one particular realm, this one particular kingdom. He is the man who handles the army. Now, if this is Ben-Hadad, or if it was some other Syrian king, it has been the custom in this land at this time that the king, when he is young and capable, even through their middle-aged years, would lead their armies out into battle. You remember King Saul would lead his armies out. David would lead his armies out until he got older. And then he had Joab to be a captain who would lead the armies out instead of David. No doubt this was a king who at one point led his own armies, was probably a warrior king, most of them were. But now, probably in his older years, has another man step into that role, a man who is still in his strength, who is capable, and because he is such a capable leader of the army, he is a man who is honored. It says he's a great man with his master, an honorable man, because the Lord had delivered Syria through him. And then it also says about him, saying all these great things, he's a mighty man in valor. You know what? That's a very simple phrase. It simply means he is a great warrior himself. That's said about a number of people throughout the Old Testament. This is a great man of power, of influence, of leadership, a great servant to his master, a mighty man of valor. And then it closes out verse 1 with a different phrase that changes all of this. But he was a leper. Now leprosy came in some different forms and also at some different levels. Someone who was mildly leprous would have the appearance, the scaly skin, the light-colored skin, things that would make you see them and know that they had the problem. But leprosy, when it would become more advanced into a later stage, could get to a point where it would kill someone. And, of course, reading throughout the Old Testament with God's dealings with Israel, if someone was leprous, they would be put outside of the camp. They would be put apart from other people because leprosy, at least once it got more advanced, was communicable. It could be passed from one person to another. So they would put that person without the camp according to God's instructions. And even if you were approaching them from a ways off, if you were, remember the distinctions there? If you were downwind, you had to give more room to make sure that you didn't come into contact with a disease that would infect you. And they would have to yell out to the other person, unclean, unclean. Make sure they stayed away and didn't catch this sickness themselves. So Naaman, having all of these things to be said about him, it closes it out by saying he's a leper. He's a man who has a problem that's going to affect him socially. It's going to affect him in his work as a leader, a military leader, a servant of the king. It probably wouldn't be long that he would have to start stepping out of those roles, and his life would change drastically. We can understand why this man wanted to be clean, why anybody would want to be clean from such a dreaded sickness. So we see in this picture of the perspective of what is splendid, we see this man set up before us as a man among men, a leader of the army, a servant of the king, a mighty man in valor, who has a problem that's going to bring him low if something isn't done about it. And then we come down a little bit further and we see another very notable character in this, another splendid character. He's the servant of the king. Whether it's Ben-Hadad or someone else is irrelevant. The name's not given to us here. But you're talking about the king of Syria. This is a nation that at this point is mighty, is powerful, is wealthy. And a king would have had access to the best of everything. So from a standpoint of power, wealth, influence, the majesty, the honor that the people would give him, much like it says about Naaman, but to an even higher degree because Naaman is his servant. So this king is going to be a very notable person. And then we read very quickly about another king, the king of Israel. Now the king who is over Naaman, the Syrian king, says when he sees this problem, I'm going to send Naaman to the king of Israel. I'm going to send him there. I'm going to send him with a letter, and I'm going to send him with a way we would say it, a truckload of wealth. He takes all these talents of silver and of gold and 10 garments. Now, if you go to the Middle East or the Far East today, you will find that oftentimes when one person is presenting gifts to another person, garments are a part of the gift. Because if you give garments that are of the right material and of the right colors, it's a very honorable and very wealthy gift to be passing along. You can go to places in India, China, places over there today, and see people even living in the poor villages who, whenever they get a chance, will buy, it won't be the most expensive material, but they'll try to get the expensive colors and dress very colorfully. Because that shows wealth. It shows accomplishment. It shows that this person is one to be honored, one to be respected. And so we understand how the garments come into this. It's not just the idea of 10 changes of clothes. These would be 10 changes of garments that would be very rich, very expensive. They would carry a lot more to them in the idea of a gift than just handing over a bunch of cloth. So he sends him with a treasure to take over to the king of Israel and to make the request of the king, I want this servant cleansed. I want him healed. I want him cured. Well, the next notable character we read about is Elisha, the man of God. What do we know about Elisha? Elisha is a prophet of God, a prophet of the Lord, of Jehovah. Elisha is a man who's been notable already because of miracles. One chapter earlier, he had raised the dead. And this is a notable prophet. a man through whom great miracles had been done. Which is why Naaman goes here in the first place, isn't it? He's going to where the power is. And he comes to the king, and the king doesn't have any answer for him. The king doesn't know what to do. It's not until Elisha hears about the king and how distraught he is, tearing his clothes, and the predicament he feels like this king of Syria has put him in, that Elisha says, stop that and send him to me. Send him down here to me, and I'll show him that there's a prophet in Israel. Now, if you go back to this time and you consider these other nations and these other kings and their miracle workers, that should be in big quotations there. Remember when Moses and Aaron went to Egypt? What was one of the first things they did to show Pharaoh that the power of God was working with them? Aaron casts his rod down and it becomes a serpent. Well, the magicians of Egypt throw their rods down and they become serpents too. But then Aaron's rod, serpent, eats up all the other ones, and then Aaron picks it up and it's a rod again. That was simply the beginning stage. We know what's coming on the heels of that. The plagues that are brought upon Egypt every time the king refuses to do what God says the way that he says to do it. Well, here, there are no doubt magicians and soothsayers, ones who would tell things and do things, sorcerers, all kinds of things that these kings had at their disposal. And being the king of a nation meant, generally speaking, you have power over all the people, and in this sense, over all the powers of the people. They would all answer to you. They would be at your beck and call. So it would be understandable why the king of Syria would send Naaman to the king of Israel. Because anything that's notable, anything that's worthwhile, anything that's this beneficial and certainly this powerful is going to be at the behest of the king. You want to know how notable Elisha is? Not just Elisha, but any true prophet of the Lord. He wasn't at the beck and call of the king. When this man Naaman shows up with his entourage and comes to the king doesn't know what to do. He feels like the king of Syria is trying to trap him, and he asks this very, very important question. Am I God? Am I Elohim? You remember who Elohim is? Elohim. In Genesis 1, in the beginning, Elohim, God in its plural form, created the heavens and the earth. All the way through chapter 1, some 31 times there, we read, Elohim said, Elohim did, Elohim saw that it was good. Over and over again, the introduction is given to the power who created the heavens and the earth, who caused everything to take its form, who caused everything to be done at every stage in its time, so that when the 6 days were completed, all of the creation was complete. And then on the seventh day, he stopped creating. Don't read on the seventh day, God rested, and think of a hammock. On the seventh day, he stopped creating. He ceased his work. He had been doing this particular creative work for 6 days. On the seventh day, he stopped his work. He wasn't worn out and needing a nap. He was simply done with the creation, so he finished. He stopped. And then we continue to read about God in the first four verses of chapter 2. But in chapter 2, it changes from talking about Elohim to another name of God. What name of God comes out in chapter 2? Now we're reading specifically about the creation of man and the creation of woman, the rib taken from his side, and we begin to read about Yahweh, which is translated and changed later on through the years to become Jehovah. A name, more of a personal name than the descriptive Elohim, God, the powerful, the mighty one. Now you're reading about not only his being self-existent, his being deity, but more of a proper name for him, which makes perfect sense. You're Adam, I created you from the dust of the ground. You're Eve, I took his rib and made you from his rib. You're Adam, you're Eve, I'm Yahweh, Jehovah. It's perfectly fitting that he would give a proper name to introduce himself to man. As we go through this text tonight, we're going to see both things being brought out, both descriptions being brought out. Am I God? Am I Elohim? Am I the Almighty? Am I the powerful one, the self-existent one who can kill and make alive, who could heal this man of leprosy? Is that who I am? Is that what you're putting on me, that I need to do this? Elijah, this very notable man in Israel, the man of God, says, you don't need to worry with this. This is not yours to do. Send him to me. Send him to me. When we're looking at the splendid things, the perspective of what is great and powerful and wealthy and influential, we see several characters here that stand out. And we can understand why the perspective locks on them the way that it does. Now look at Naaman for just a few minutes and the king of Syria, and think about the perspective of their expectations, of their assumptions, based from their perspective, from the way they see things and look at things. We see, first of all, that this king of Syria writes a letter to the king of Israel. Now, that's not who he was told about. Naaman was not told about the king of Israel. But when this comes to the king of Syria, he writes a letter to the king of Israel. If you come to Syria, I'm the man to get something done for you. I'm the man to handle whatever can be handled in my country. If you're going to bring somebody to Syria, you bring them to me. So if I'm going to send them to Israel, I'm going to send him to the king. Notice the perspective there. The king should be able to handle things. The king should, listen, there shouldn't have even been a king there. God didn't want there to be a king there. You remember when Samuel was the last of the judges, was a priest, was a prophet, and was standing between God and Israel? And the Israelites were saying, make us a king like all the other nations. And Samuel was saying, don't do this. No, you don't want this. They said, make us a king. So Samuel goes to God. And God says, give them what they're asking for. Give them a king. But when you go back to them, tell them they're going to regret this decision. Because their king is going to take from them, is going to tax them, is going to take their children, is going to take their horses. Their king is going to be a king. When what they should have had and appreciated and looked to all along was me, God. They've had a king above them all the time, but not some earthly king who's going to make missteps and lead them into wrong ways and cause problems. They've had the God of heaven and earth leading them. But they want a king, give them a king. Well, now you're several generations down the line, and the kings have brought all kinds of problems into Israel. The division, Israel and Judah. Now we're looking in Samaria, the northern part of the land, the king of the northern nation, and we're seeing these problems still brought out. But the king of Syria sees things from a perspective. And his perspective is, if you want something great done, you go to the greatest person of the land. Go to the king. So he sends a letter, and Naaman brings this letter to the king. And when he brings this letter, he brings it with great expectation, with a great assumption. If there's healing to be had, it must be able to come from the king. So he presents the king with the letter, and obviously we don't get to hear the whole letter. Most of the time, the letters that were written back then were letters that would have a lot of pomp and circumstance to them. It'd have a lot of great and gracious greetings, and then maybe the request be made, and then again a lot of praise and adoration at the close. We're turning to you because you're so great and you're so mighty, and we've heard good things, and so here's our request from you. Naaman simply says what the request is. I'm a leper. I need to be healed. My king is requesting of you, king of Israel, that you heal me, that you take care of my problem. Well, the king of Israel knows something just as well as anybody else. He doesn't have the power to do this. He doesn't have the capability to do this. If he did, he most likely would have been joyful to help this man and receive the treasure. And think about what you studied a few weeks ago during Vacation Bible School when Balaam is sent for by Balak. You remember what Balak did? He sent some people to go get Balaam, and he sent them with treasures. He sent them with the rewards of divination. We're going to hire you, Balaam. We're going to pay you your due, so you come over here and you curse the army of Israel for me. Well, Naaman has come to the king of Israel in a similar fashion, coming to him with all of this treasure, all of this bounty, and saying, I've brought you all of this, and here's what my request is of you. Well, it's understandable that the king is upset. He knows there's nothing he can do about it. It's strange to me that Elisha doesn't immediately come to his mind. It's strange to me that he doesn't say, you know what, I can't do this myself, but I know somebody who can. That's not where his mind goes with this. His mind goes to, I don't have this kind of power. I know I don't have it. I know you all know I don't have it. I know the king of Syria knows that I don't have this power. So he's trying to build up a situation where he can become my enemy. He's going to ask something of me that's impossible for me to give, and he's going to use this to attack me. You know, Syria and Israel had a lot of problems during this time. In fact, you remember at the beginning of this, back in verse 2, there is a young servant girl, a servant maid of Israel, who was carried off by the Syrians, because the Syrians were known for taking, the way we term it historically, marauding bands to go into places, to attack cities, to carry off goods and servants and anything they could. And they had been doing this to Israel for quite some time. So it's not a strange thing to learn that there's a young girl here who has been carried off and is now the servant of Naaman's wife. So when Naaman goes, he goes to the king, and he's expecting the king to turn to his God. Now here's another notable thing, an assumption, an expectation. Syria had their own gods. The Assyrians had their own gods. Egypt had their own gods. How many nations do we read about in the Bible that were not Israel that had their own gods? Some of them became so notable in history that we now have a lot of mythology and things that are tied to them. The Greek gods, the Roman gods, every nation that we know of that was not adhering to the God of heaven and earth came up with their own gods. Sometimes they were off of other nations' gods, the ideas they got from somebody else. Remember when Israel went to the wilderness, when they finally got away from Egypt after the plagues were done, when Moses had gone up into the mountain and stayed there for weeks, when God became irritated and told Moses what was going on, you remember what the Israelites were doing? They had come to Aaron and said, we want you to make us a calf, a golden calf. And they gave Aaron their gold, and he melted it down, and he fashioned a calf, and they were naked and dancing and worshiping around this golden calf. Why? Because that's what they learned in Egypt. That's what they learned from somebody else. And this idea of the gods of one land, that they wouldn't take the same names, it was a different language usually. They would make up their own gods, often patterned off of another nation. But throughout history, we see all of these gods, all of these made-up deities that men would worship and would treat in different ways. And so it's not something unheard of for a man like Naaman to come to Israel and say, we've got our gods, but I've heard good things about something that can happen through you and therefore through your God. So you turn to your God. I felt sure, remember when he went to Elisha finally? And Elisha doesn't even come out to speak to him? Now you tell me that if a dignitary, somebody who is influential and wealthy and powerful from a nation comes to visit another nation, you tell me that people don't roll out the red carpet for them and treat them like royalty and treat them in the best conceivable ways because of who they are. And Naaman knows his own stature. He knows his own place and position in Syria. And coming with a letter from the king of Syria, introducing him to the king of Israel, he would no doubt expect the best and most respectful treatment that anybody could ever expect. So he has another expectation. Not only does he come to the wrong person, but when he comes to the king, and the king doesn't know what to do, and Elisha says, send him down here. He goes to Elisha, and Elisha doesn't even come to the door. He gets to Elisha's house, he dismounts his chariot, and the person that comes to the door is a servant, a messenger. He has another expectation, not only of how he should be received and treated, but when the messenger comes to the door, he comes with a very simple message. You go to the Jordan River, you dip 7 times, and you will come forth clean. And it says Naaman was wroth. Why? Because he already had built up in his mind what was going to happen. I am coming to this great king. I'm coming now to this great man of God, this prophet. I'm coming for a very great purpose, to be healed of a sickness that doctors and medicines can't handle. I'm coming for a miracle. And I come to this man's house, and he doesn't come out and greet me. He sends a servant out to deliver a message. And the message is a message that I can't stand, that I can't abide. You travel from where they are in Samaria would have taken about 40 miles to travel over to the Jordan. You get back in your chariot and you go about 40 miles and you dip yourself in the Jordan River 7 times. He says, look, we've got better rivers back in Damascus. The Abana, the far part, we've got better. Why couldn't I dip in those and be clean? If I'm going to dip in a river, I could dip in better rivers than the Jordan. But before he says that, before he starts reasoning along those lines, first he talks about his expectations. He says, behold, I thought not some servant of the man of God. I thought this man of God would come out here and stand face to face with me. I thought that he would cry out to his God, that he would rise his hand up. It says in the King James, strike his hand. The idea is the raising, the waving, like a posture. I thought he would make some great entrance, and I thought he would do some great spectacle, and that his God would cleanse me of my leprosy. I had this all worked out in my mind, what a grand show and spectacle this was going to be. But he doesn't come to the door. He sends a servant, and the servant tells me to go dip in the dirty Jordan 7 times. I've got to get back in my chariot, go 40 miles, and dip in. I could have dipped in rivers back home. I could go bathe myself in much better accommodations than what this man is telling me to do. How is this going to cleanse me? And he goes away in a rage. Now, we see people get angry sometimes. They get angry about a situation, about the way something's happening. They deal with it. They go on. It's different when you say that someone is wroth. Someone is in a rage. You're talking about a great emotional reaction. And Naaman is bound up in this. He is bound up to the point that he's come all the way from his home to Israel, and now he's about to ride away in his chariot and go back home a leper and stay a leper and die a leper. That's how emotionally distraught he is. Then in verse 13, his servants ask him a question. If this prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldst thou not have done it? Look at what you brought. You brought a treasure. He brought so much that it would have made 10 men wealthy for the rest of their lives. He brought a fortune. And they asked him a question. What if he'd asked you to do something great, something notable, something that would be fitting of a mighty man of valor and captain of a host of the king of Syria? Wouldn't you have done it? Not only would you have done it, you would have gladly done it and considered it fair payment for having this leprosy taken away. You would have thought that was completely reasonable. But because he's asked you to do something simple, Why are you going to walk away from that? He listens to his servants wisely, changes his attitude. He goes the 40 miles or so to the Jordan River. He dipped 7 times, and after the 7th time, he came up clean, completely free of the leprosy. We've been talking about the things that are splendid, the things that would hit from a perspective of the high and the mighty. What about the simple things that we read in this text? Do you remember where he first heard about this? The potential for being healed? From a little servant maid. Very insignificant. A foreigner who had been captured and had been brought back and is now a servant to his wife. And we read about this young lady, this girl, making a statement. Oh, I wish. I know in the King James you read, would God that my Lord was with the man of God, the prophet in Israel. That's not literally her calling upon the name of God there. It's a statement of wish, of desire. I wish that my master could be there for someone to help him, because I know there's someone who could help him. So by word of mouth, he doesn't get a vision. He doesn't have a dream. There's not some prophet that comes to his house and talks to him. The way he learns about this is by word of mouth of a little young lady, an Israelite, who knows about the man of God. So she makes a statement, and from this statement, he goes to his king. His king writes a letter to another king. He goes to the king, and what ends up happening? The king of Israel learns his place, doesn't he? He doesn't have Elisha sitting in his palace, sitting next to him at his beck and call. The prophet has to hear about what's going on and send to the king and say, this is not yours to do. Send him to me. Shows the proper position of a prophet, a man of God, and the king of Israel. God comes first. God is the highest. So he comes to the prophet, who he would think should be subservient to the king. But instead, the prophet has to tell the king, send him over here. I'll show him there's a prophet in Israel. I'll show him there's a man of God in Israel. I'll show him what the answer is to this, how this is going to be solved. And when he comes, a servant gives him the message. It's the message of the prophet, which is the message of God. But a servant delivers it to him. Again, simple. When he is so upset about the situation and leaving in a rage, remember who talks to him? His servants. His servants talk to him and say, if he asked you to do some great thing, you would have done it. Why not do the simple thing? What was simple? What was simple was there was nothing elaborate. There was nothing that was going to be of Naaman's power or his king's power or the king of Israel's power. There was nothing great and notable and powerful among men that was going to have anything to do with this. You go out there and you tell him to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River. A very simple solution. He didn't come out and make himself appear glorious. He didn't come out with great presence and call upon God and strike the air with his hand and cure this man's illness. He stayed in the house and sent a messenger out to tell him a much more simple solution. Go dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan. When we start talking about people being cured or cleansed of leprosy, that's one thing. What do we learn from this and bring forward from this today? There are people who are languishing in sin who are looking for a way out. And do you know what they do? They approach it with a perspective. This is what my grandparents did. This is what my parents did. If it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And they use their own reasoning, they use their own perspective, and they do what feels good to them, and they expect God to take care of everything. Well, I understand what this is saying, but my preacher says, I have been hearing all of my life that baptism has nothing to do with saving you, because there's a verse over here that says you're saved by faith. And there's a verse over here that says you're saved by grace. And there's a verse over here that says it doesn't have to do with works. And so when I piece those things together from here, there, and yonder, what I've got built up in my mind is, I don't have to be baptized to be saved. But you know, there's a verse that says that too. The like figure whereunto baptism doth also now save us. There are verses that say this. Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ. But they've got a perspective. And the perspective always has to do with where you've come from. What you've already learned. What you've already locked in as your faith. And like Naaman, what we are all bound to do is step outside of our perspective and work to understand and benefit from God's perspective. Because God's perspective is simple. It's not elaborate. It doesn't take great wealth and great power and great honor and influence. It doesn't take any of that. What it takes is a change of perspective where we will see God for who He really is, and we will see ourselves for who we really are. You know, Naaman was the captain of the hosts of the king of Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, a very, very loved and great servant of his master. He was all of these things. But the end of verse 1 catches all of the attention. But he was a leper. He had a problem. He was diseased, and it would humiliate him. It would, in that sense, not that he's a king, but it would dethrone him from all of his position eventually, and it would kill him. That's what he needed help with. That's what he came seeking help for. That's why he came to Israel. That's why he ended up at the doorstep of the man of God. His perspective had to be changed so that he had to realize, I'm not going to pay a great sum. I'm not going to do a great deed. I'm going to humble myself, and I'm going to do what this man of God is telling me to do. I'm going to simply do it. And when he did, he came out clean. He got what he was looking for. But he got it through the means and the perspective of simplicity, of trusting God. I mentioned earlier from Genesis 1 and 2, Elohim and Yahweh. Read your text very carefully through there. If you have the King James, New King James, American Standard, I think even the New American Standard, you will note when you get right down to the end of what we just read tonight that Naaman refers to the God of Israel as Elohim, and he refers to Him as Jehovah. He has not only learned that Israel has the God of power. In fact, he says there's no other God in all the earth except for the God of Israel. But then he also says, I'm not going to offer sacrifices anymore to any other gods, only to Jehovah, to Yahweh. He had not only learned of this God, he had learned His name. And from that point on, Naaman says, I'm seeking a relationship with Him, and only with Him. May we all have the same attitude, the same desire, and may we all be, if necessary, like Naaman, be driven to where we will open up to the perspective of simplicity and listen to the God who created us, who loves us, and who wants to save us. Thank you for your time tonight.